Hello, everyone. I'm Captain Logan, and it's still not Spawn year. That was 10 years ago. I'm not sure where you've been, but this is day 5 of my comic review video day calendar. Try saying that 3 times fast. And this issue actually has quite a few things to do with Todd McFarlane and Spider-Man on multiple points. This is Spider-Man number 17. This comes out in 1991 and is about a year and a half or so into the book that McFarlane popularized with his Spider-Man number 1. That's the first of this series, which sold over 1 million copies. That was the beginning of the Torment arc, which I remember being really nonsensical. I haven't read that in a long time. It sets up Spawn beautifully. It's written just like that. And I'm going to try, by the way, not to talk too much about Spawn because, again, it's not Spawn year. But Todd McFarlane himself, of course, is up for grabs. He is really instrumental and important to the history of several major superhero characters and is really formative in creating my love for some of these characters in the first place. And so a lot of the reason that I went after this issue, which I had never read before, is because it's got Thanos on the cover, and I love Thanos, and it's Todd McFarlane looking Spider-Man. This is, at least look-wise, my Spider-Man. And you know, characterization and that moment in time in the history for that character also. I grew up with Peter Parker married, his being an adult, and his looking like a more intimidating character than the more scrawny high school student that he was drawn as by Ditko when he and Stan Lee started the series. I've told this story before, but when I was a kid, I got to Spider-Man kind of late, relatively, after I was already a big fan of Batman and had even looked at X-Men some, and Superman, some other DC stuff, but Spider-Man was around. I knew of it, but I hadn't really looked at anything. The animated series wasn't on yet, and I got into a lot of this stuff by way of extra media, even though I was reading comics. So for comics, it was some Batman, it was some Superman, not really very much in the way of Marvel yet. And then I went to a friend's house for his overnight birthday party, and he was huge into Spider-Man, and he gave everybody there an issue. This was like a ritual for him. He had a big comic collection, and he had a long box of issues that he was willing to part with, and everybody got to take one home. And I don't remember which issue I got, but it was, if not a McFarlane Spider-Man, a Spider-Man in that style, certainly, that early 90s house style, and I think it had Venom or Carnage or both in it. It might have even been a Maximum Carnage issue. I'm not sure, because this would have been 93, 94, I think. And so I start with Spider-Man with a more gnarly, darker-looking Spider-Man. He's contorted. He's got the webbing that's complicated and has a lot of lines, and he's doing all these poses that are just absolutely impossible. He's really muscular, and you see that in this issue right away, because again, that's what's really selling and what Spider-Man looks like on the whole at Marvel right then. And this is, by the way, drawn by Rick Leonardi and written by Ann Nesenti. This issue is completely standalone, and that's a good thing and a bad thing for this particular issue. So cover to cover, you don't really have to read anything before or after this to understand what's happening in this issue, and the only thing that, in fact, it probably reads better if you don't, because the timeline of it gets a little bit confusing. One of the other reasons I went ahead and grabbed this one is because I was kind of surprised to see Thanos holding a broken Spider-Man right around the end, publication-wise, of Infinity Gauntlet. This is labeled, and of course these things very often come out a couple months before the date that's on the cover, but it's dated December, which is the last month that Infinity Gauntlet came out. Infinity Gauntlet number 6 comes out in December of 91. And so I'm thinking, okay, is this a tie-in issue to Infinity Gauntlet? It's a little strange that it doesn't have any branding there. Were there very many single issues, or I should say, singles of ongoings that tied directly into Infinity Gauntlet? I'm sure there were some. I don't really remember a lot of that. It's not like later where every book and its dog would have to have some kind of connection to the big event that was going on. Infinity Gauntlet reads real well by itself. It doesn't have a ton of tie-ins and minis and things that you have to look at to understand what's happening. That comes later. But so I took a look at this, wondering what we're even doing with that the very last month of Infinity Gauntlet. And one of two things is happening here, because it's very ambiguous about the timeline. Either nearly everything that happens in this issue is in Spider-Man's head and it's all a dream and it's kind of pointless. And this reads, by the way, ultimately very throwaway and like it doesn't really matter. And as you're reading it, Nacynthia writes it with the sense of importance and gravitas, and like Spider-Man's learning this really major life lesson about mortality and whether or not being a superhero is, as Thanos says, futile. Of course, Thanos is a very nihilistic character, and that's why he worships death. And you have big, heavy ideas, although real typical ideas in these kinds of superhero comics. The question of free will versus fate, and whether it's pointless to try to save people, because after all, we do have a mythic pantheon of sorts where death knows already who's going to die when, and if you're interfering with that, Thanos says you're playing God to some degree. Spider-Man doesn't understand that right away. He's like, I mean, I'm not doing that on purpose. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just trying to help people. It's responsibility, right? And Thanos says, if you try to be a hero, you are causing more problems than you're solving, which is another big idea that we deal with all the time with superhero stories and comics, in movies, etc. Would Peter Parker be better off? Would the world be better off if he just left well enough alone? And you've got, all the villains that are created indirectly when Thanos brings this up, because of choices that our hero makes. And so it feels like it really matters, at least internally, for Peter Parker. And then when you get to the end of the issue, there's a little bit of a question of whether anything you've been looking at is actually real. Does Spider-Man actually go to an afterlife here? I'm inclined to think he must, and that it probably isn't just a dream. But there's a couple things that really throw me off with that. And the first thing is, I don't know how much about Thanos and death and that whole mythology Spider-Man is privy to at this point in time. If it takes place after Infinity Gauntlet, maybe, although I also don't know how much memory people all retain from some of what they learn in that. It's been a while since I've read Infinity Gauntlet, and I don't think everybody's minds are wiped necessarily, but of course, half the universe is killed there, like with the movies, but it's very different. It's for different reasons. And they're resurrected, and some of those events never happened. So I don't remember whether or not Spider-Man knows about some of that mythology, but it doesn't matter for the sake of this, because this can't be after Infinity Gauntlet. Spider-Man sees Thanos here, and immediately he says, wait a minute, aren't you dead? Because Thanos died and served death before Infinity Gauntlet, and then from at the beginning of that, he's faked his own death, and Silver Surfer finds him and is like, oh, wait a minute, you're supposed to be dead. And so this is consistent with what's happening before Infinity Gauntlet, as far as I can tell. But then you get to the end of the issue, and it's so dismissive and throwaway, and ends on kind of an unfunny zinger, and it makes me think none of this really matters, and I'm not sure Peter Parker even learned anything from it. It's kind of a bummer ending in that way, because it kind of ultimately reads like just a lot of pointless soul-searching and questioning It's kind of like a revival sort of thing, like a soul revival thing, uh, like a Baptist church tent revival or something, where Peter has to reaffirm his beliefs, not religious beliefs, but his belief in what he's doing and being a superhero, in the idea of Spider-Man, and it's almost like this is what makes me start to lean more toward. I'm not sure any of this is actually happening. It kind of feels like he's ultimately justifying his life choices by creating a scenario in his mind where he's able to save a little girl by convincing Death that she doesn't deserve to die. So real quick, let me set up the initial premise here, 11 minutes into this video. So at the beginning, Peter is swinging around and on his way to bring barbecue sauce to Aunt May. At first I thought maybe it was some kind of a Thanksgiving party or something. There doesn't seem to be any particular occasion. She's just out of barbecue sauce, and that's the bookend for this whole thing, is Aunt May needs barbecue sauce. Okay. And very often at the beginning of an issue like this that stands on its own, there'll be a little bit of recap to get you in a sense of time and place of where we are in the series. So you would expect this to open with Peter's internal monologue saying something like, man, I'm sure glad that whole business with the I'm trying to think of a villain, that whole business with Magneto or with Doctor Doom is over now. I'm sure glad we put that behind us. There's nothing like that in this, and this could take place literally any time before Infinity Gauntlet and after Thanos is dead. So Spider-Man saves some guys on some scaffolding and tosses the scaffolding and accidentally blows up. It's not a transformer. What is it? He's real. He's real overconfident, as he says. He's real full of himself. He says, I could do this in my sleep. And then he saves these guys. He throws the scaffolding, and then a cooling machine. I'm sure that has a better name, real generic name. A cooling machine. It's filled with Freon. And so now he has to save this woman and little girl who were doing laundry on a roof. And he does his best, but he ends up getting, he thinks, killed in the process. And what he discovers, ostensibly, is that he is dead and he's in the afterlife. And the woman, the mom, is alive, but the child is somewhere between life and death. And fate would have her die, but again, Peter is going to convince Death through this real easy speech that happens in 2 panels that being a hero is worth doing, and that he can change the course of fate for the good. And so he says, Death looks like a reasonable person, which I think is kind of a fun line. And then something that means that he should get to live and this little girl should also. And so then he wakes up at the end and everything is fine. So some kind of curious things about this. First of all, when Peter dies, it seems like it's because of the Freon. He gets hit really hard with Freon. We get an internal monologue, or I should say we get third-person narration, which is a kind of break in our POV that I don't care for. It's pretty pointless. And there's a lot of early 90s comics that do this, but we have so much actual first-person internal monologue. I don't understand why we need this, especially because it also gives us some internal monologue for Peter. So it's like Peter is thinking this. And then later, most of the rest of it will just be narrated first person by Peter in the narration boxes. So why do we even need those? But we were given there that he is wrapped up in a cocoon of Freon, and this is a line I kind of liked, but that it's like he's in cryostasis of Freon, and he says that his his life doesn't flash before his eyes, and maybe that's because his eyes feel like peeled grapes. That's how much his body, like his mask, is being ripped straight from his face. I think there's kind of a visual metaphor, kind of some imagery going on with that, where again the futility or lack thereof of being a hero. He's got the mask ripped off. Maybe being a hero was pointless. Here's just this young guy behind that who is not the icon that the Spider-Man mask would lead you to believe that he is, and so he has to kind of face his mortality and face the identity of that. He's Peter and Spider-Man at the same time. It's kind of like the split Spider-Man face thing, just with a ripped mask, even though it's not down the center. But I do like that image. But then we're told later that he just had a heart attack, that it wasn't the Freon that killed him. So I kind of wondered about that. And then we get the mom. You know, Thanos says, you're allowed, when you die, to look back. Everybody can look back one more time and kind of reflect on their life. He says he's only coming to Spider-Man because... So, again, he works for death, and he's kind of like the ferryman or something, bringing you into the afterlife. We never see what the actual afterlife looks like. All we know is that it's not what any of the religions believed or predicted. All of the iconography, as you see here, of all the different religions is all piled up like on a lawn, like... it says here, like junk on a front lawn, like busted toasters and cracked bathtubs and stuff, which is a provocative image that I like quite a bit, although I wonder if any of this is supposed to actually be real, if it fits at all with any of the celestial and afterlife stuff that we've gotten with anything Marvel before, because more often it feels like all of the religions somehow or rather fit together, or even if they're contradictory, they all exist and simultaneously, or some bits of them, they're like grains of truth. Like you have in DC and Marvel both have this. You have vampire lore, which is rooted in Christianity, so some of that has to be real, and then you have all the Norse stuff where you have characters who go to hell with one L when they die. All that stuff actually exists, but this suggests that everybody has it wrong, and all of those were just ways of trying to interpret what's really there for everyone, which again is not especially consistent, but then a lot of the interpretations of real-world religions are not consistent in comics. I mean, I'll give that a pass, but it's yet another thing that makes me wonder, is this supposed to actually be Peter tapping into the afterlife or being right on the verge of it or not? I should also mention this is a pretty typical one-and-done sort of story that we get with a lot of characters and genre stuff in general, but especially in comics, where you'll have somebody who seems to be dead and then they come to learn that it's not their time, and they wake up for a chance to get things more right and to appreciate the mortality and just how precious our limited time on this planet is. That kind of old chestnut. And there's another comic from right around the same time, I guess maybe a year or two after this, during Reign of the Supermen, where that same thing will happen with Jonathan Kent, where he's right on the verge of death and doesn't actually die. I forget which issue that is, but it's in one of the 4 Superman books. It was a big kind of landmark issue, but I digress. So Peter goes and sees all the like junk relics on the lawn, and then Thanos tells him that he only comes to heroes because or people that try to be heroes, claim to be heroes, because he wants them to understand how futile it was for them to try to go up against death and stave off death, which speaks to the difference in philosophies, or how these two characters look at the notion of death. For the personified female death, her job is a necessary evil. Everybody has their time. She doesn't relish it. She doesn't enjoy seeing people die, but it is nevertheless something that has to be done. She has that in common with the DC death. So she's not a nihilist like Thanos is. He worships the idea of death, and therefore the personified female death, and really enjoys the process. And she doesn't have that exactly, but she has that a little bit in common with Neil Gaiman's death, who I think kind of enjoys her job more than this one does, but not in a sadistic way, where she comes to find that this is in the first volume of Sandman, and in the TV show too, by the way. Wonderful episode that that translates that issue really faithfully to screen, where she comes to realize that her job is not so much about taking people, killing people, as it is comforting them as they die and helping them to make the transition, which isn't exactly what this death is doing. This one seems to more be there to, it doesn't actually go to Earth, by the way. Just death happens because this character exists and it has to. But as Spider-Man says, she's more reasonable than Thanos. She has some empathy for the people who she has to see cross over. And I think one of the big differences between them is kind of the two faces of death, where you have, the skeleton face, the real sinister, it's your time, everybody returns to dust kind of image, and then the veiled, kind of tragic, sad lady face. It's everybody's time at some point. It's sad, it's tragic, but this is what has to be done. And so there's the side of her that is death, and there's the side of her that is sympathetic to people dying. So anyway, as I said, she and Thanos look at this very differently. It's the reason that Thanos can never really be with death ultimately the way he wants to, and why she spurns him a lot. And then, like I said, it's kind of too easy that Spider-Man is able to convince her to let these people live, or to let himself and the little girl live. There's also this moment, I started to mention this earlier, where as he's looking back, Spider-Man hears the woman say she hates him because he saved her and not the little girl. You'd think it might be more because he did a thing callously that led to their getting killed. So even though he tried to save them, it was his fault that they died, which is why he's so guilty in the first place, which is a classic Peter Parker situation. No matter what his intentions are, good or bad, there very often are unintended consequences to things. But this is also a situation where he did kind of make a mistake. If only he had been a little bit more careful and it hadn't been so big for his britches, maybe none of this would have happened in the first place. But then there's no sense, after he comes back to reality, when he wakes up in his body, that this woman was ever mad at him. And I don't know if any of that actually happened. So that was kind of my big question, big takeaway. And I really dislike the last panel here, where Peter ends the whole thing just saying, oh no, the barbecue sauce spilled. For a minute, he thinks there's blood everywhere. The woman that he saved says, no, it's just barbecue sauce. Oh no, Aunt May is going to kill me. But ching. Because he was on the verge of death, and he actually met the personified version of death. And then he comes back to life, and oh no, Aunt May is going to kill me. Ah, ha, ha, ha. It's very throwaway, and it's a very dismissive ending, and I really don't care for that. But overall, I appreciated this mostly just for artwork, because this is kind of my favorite period for Spider-Man, especially visually. But it's got a lot of those kind of hallmarks of early. I hate to say, somewhat like pedestrian superhero comic writing in the early 90s. Like, I realize that this is a commercial medium, and it's very often not to be taken too horribly seriously, but this particular issue is real overwritten in places, and I think wants me to take it a lot more seriously than I ultimately can, especially with that ending. And I really don't like a lot of that narration that just oversells the whole thing. This needed another draft. It needed probably, I don't know, 20, 30% of the lines, just, especially in narration, just marked out. So I found myself, this is another place that it has something in common with McFarlane, I guess. I found myself wanting to kind of take a pen to it and edit it as I was going along. But yeah, so to recap real quick, it's like McFarlane in that it's about crossing over to the afterlife. We're almost doing that. We're dealing with death. We're dealing with Todd McFarlane's Spider-Man, with that look and that atmosphere, that feel, and it's making a lot of the same mistakes of the things I least like in early 90s comics. It's also in the same series as his Spider-Man, and this comes out just a few months before Spawn will. So kind of an interesting thing, kind of an interesting relic. Not the best story in the world, and I've gone on for too long about it. But thanks a lot, everybody, as always, for watching, and I'll see you again tomorrow with another one. Happy reading, folks.